Have you ever shared your faith only to be ignored, or maybe prayed for someone for years and nothing seemed to change? It's easy to wonder, is the gospel really working? The Apostle Paul answers that question by saying that Christians are like the fragrance of Christ. To some, that fragrance brings life, to others, it brings death. 2 Corinthians 2, verses 15 and 16 says, "For we are unto God a sweet Savior of Christ, in them that are saved, and in them that perish. To the one we are the Savior of death unto death, and to the other the Savior of life unto life. And who is sufficient for these things?" Now, this is Spurgeon's 26th sermon, the two effects of the gospel. And point number one is that the gospel never leaves anyone unchanged, because we often imagine the gospel as neutral. People either accept it or ignore it, but Paul says that every time the gospel is proclaimed, it produces a response. It either causes the heart to harden or soften. The difference isn't in the message, but in the heart that receives it, because the same sun that melts the wax also hardens the clay. The gospel works similarly. The question is, will we allow it to be accepted into our hearts, or will we resist and reject it? This comes to point number two. Rejecting greater light carries greater responsibility, aka accountability. That's the key word. The more clearly we hear God's truth, the more responsible we become for what we heard, because Jesus himself taught this. Because rejecting the gospel after hearing it isn't simply like missing information, it's refusing God's invitation. He's saying, "Here, I want you to be saved," and you're saying, "No, thank you." And that's why hearing the gospel is never insufficient. Every sermon, every conversation, and every verse we read is an opportunity to respond to God's grace, because the Bible is a gift. And this leads to point number three. The gospel changes lives because it's centered on Christ. Because you can't simply tell people to be better and expect their hearts to change. Rules alone can't create new life, or else the law could give life. That's the Old Testament, but the law can't give life. When Christ is preached, however, that's when people are transformed, because forgiveness replaces guilt, grace replaces striving, loving Jesus changes what willpower could never do. Christianity isn't primarily behavior modification, it's a heart transformed through and by Christ. And this leads to point number four. Faithfulness matters more than visible success. Now, this is probably one of the more encouraging parts, because Paul says that ministers are pleasing aromas to God, whether people believe or reject the message, because God just wants us to plant and water the seeds of his kingdom. He is the one that gives the growth. God doesn't measure our success by metrics like we do. God measures our success by this simple question: were you faithful? Beyond the pastors, parents, friends, missionaries, or anyone sharing Christ, our responsibility is faithfulness. Well done, my good and faithful servant. The results, now those belong to God. We just need to do what he tells us to do. And this leads to point number five. No one can do this work alone, because Paul ends by saying, who is sufficient for these things? The implied answer is no one. No preacher, no missionary, no Christian is adequate in their own strength. And that's why we depend on God's Spirit. The gospel doesn't work because we're persuasive enough. It works because God gives life. Our confidence has never been in our own ability. It has always been in his power. So maybe you've been discouraged because someone you love still hasn't believed or trusted God, Jesus Christ, with their life and their soul. But don't stop believing, don't stop praying, don't stop loving, don't stop sharing Christ, because your calling isn't to save people. Only Jesus can do that. Your calling is to be faithful, to faithfully point people to Jesus, because God is responsible for the harvest. God is responsible for the growth. So the question I have for you today is, are you measuring success by people's response, or are you measuring success by your faithfulness to Christ? God bless.